Right. And your host today is the Denmark chapter. More specifically, Julia Kiosi is the chair of the Denmark chapter. And myself, I'm Jordan Sunzis. I'm the vice chair of the chapter. And we're excited today for having with us Louise Whiteley at this webinar series. Louise is associate professor and curator at the Medical Museion of the University of Copenhagen, here in Copenhagen. And she's also a colleague of mine at Renew, the Novo Nordisk Foundation Center for Stem Cell Medicine. So today she will share her research and practical experience around science communication and how that is much more than just translating the words to layman's terms. I hope it will be very interesting for all of you. Louise?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for joining on a Friday afternoon. I really appreciate your attention and looking forward to sharing the presentation today. Okay. Have we got full screen slides? Yes, thanks, George. Okay. So in the talk today, I am going to start by introducing myself, so saying a little bit more about where I come from, why I do the kind of work I do, and the place that I work, so the museum that my research group is based in. I then want to step back a little bit and give a very brief and necessarily simplified history of different approaches to science communication, which gives the background for understanding why we focus on things like emotions, materiality, and identity, as well as about good translation of scientific language into layman's terms. I'll try and kind of land that with where I think we are now in kind of cutting edge approaches to thinking about science communication. And then at the end, share some concrete examples from the last few years of work myself and colleagues have done for public engagement with microbiome research. And I'll say more about that when we get there. And then I'll leave, of course, time for questions and discussion. If you have any urgent questions as I'm going along, please type in the chat and Julia will keep an eye on that, or else unmute and shout if I'm saying something that really provokes you, or I've forgotten something very important that you need to share, or else we'll leave time for discussion at the end. Okay, so my kind of background, I always see myself as kind of dancing between science and society. So my bachelor's degree was in experimental psychology, so quite a kind of scientific discipline, and philosophy of science and philosophy of mind. So I was always trying to understand how is science knowing things and what's the history of how we got ideas about why we should do those experiments at all. So I was always interested in this kind of critical social perspective on why science works the way it does. However, I decided to really try and dive into science. So I did my PhD in neuroscience at UCL. But the whole time I was doing public engagement work. I did public talks and education activities. And then I did an art science project where we wrote radio plays investigating the ways that different understandings of how the brain relates to mental illness has shaped societal attitudes to people with mental illness and who commit crimes over time. And the reason I started going in that direction was as I was working in neuroscience laboratories in London, I started noticing that the ideas we were tackling in the lab were really all over popular culture. So I was working in a human neuroimaging functional MRI laboratory, and I was seeing all over the newspapers in the early 2000s, hundreds of fMRI images being published, suggesting that researchers now could tell us where in the brain we could find experiences of love, of religion, we could explain mental illness, we could understand the human condition through this way of visualizing the brain. As a scientist, I was very upset by this because I was like, that's definitely not what we can tell you yet. So I started to get really interested in the way that this research was being hyped, but also in the way it was tapping into very old histories of how we think about the brain and its relationship to our self and our ways of being. So I was seeing images like this in the media. So here you've got a cartoon where we've got on the left-hand side an extrovert who's having dopamine poured into their brain and shouting more, more, more. And on the right, we've got an introvert who's having dopamine poured in and saying, oh, enough. And you can see on the right the text suggesting that extroverts have very low sensitivity to dopamine, so require large amounts, while introverts are highly sensitive to dopamine. Too much of it makes them overstimulated. So I was very interested in how this was very oversimplifying what we knew about dopamine and what we know about personality and extroversion and introversion, but it was really tapping into our cultural understandings of ourselves. So people weren't waiting for scientists to tell them the right way to use scientific information. They were grabbing it with both hands and starting to use it to understand themselves. So this really made me think that public engagement with neuroscience, particularly at the time, was really important because it was shaping how we understand ourselves, and that could have consequences for how we treat each other, how we organize the mental health system, how we think about children in schools struggling, for example. There's so many implications of understanding our brains and our personalities and ourselves through the language of the brain. And here I want to share a little bit of philosophy with you, which is a concept from Ian Hacking, which he calls looping effects. And I'm just going to read this quote and then I'll say what I think it means. So Hacking writes that a looping effect is how a causal understanding, if known by those who are understood, can change their character, can change the kind of people they are. And that can lead to a change in the causal understanding itself. So to unpack that a little bit with a concrete example, you might say if someone understands their extroversion or introversion as due to how their brain processes dopamine, they might start changing how they behave. They might start eating foods that they think increase dopamine. They might start avoiding situations which they read in a self-help book might give them the wrong kinds of dopamine. And that might in turn actually change their biology eventually by changing the way they act. And that in turn eventually could loop back around into science and change the way change the phenomenon that science is studying. So Hacking's idea is that these looping effects mean that the ways we understand ourselves through science can eventually change who we are and therefore change the thing that science is studying and the way it's studying it. And I think that's one reason that science communication is about much more than just translating words, and it really matters to who we are and how we experience ourselves and the possibilities for our communities and our futures. And the image of the book I've got on the right, some of you might have read it. If not, it's a fantastic read. It's called Crazy Like Me, and it's about what's happened in probably not the last couple of decades, but prior to that, when categories of psychiatric disorder and mental illness were exported from the English-speaking world around the world. So, for example, there's a chapter in there writing about where in Japan, they didn't have the same concept of depression as is had in America. But when that concept was exported to Japan, people started to actually experience their symptoms differently by having those different brain-based concepts for understanding depression. So I got really passionate about this and I decided to quit science, and I did a master's in science communication and toured the art science project I'd done during my PhD. I decided that I wanted to actually stay in research and not become a professional science communicator. So that took me through a postdoc in bioethics and eventually here to Medical Museion in Copenhagen, where I try to study those kind of effects whereby biomedical science shapes the way we think about who we are, but at the same time try and actually, make the world better by doing new kinds of communication or public engagement, which I hope helps people ask more curious questions, more critical questions about what they're being told in the mainstream media about science and what it means for our futures. And as I've got at the bottom here, I feel extremely fortunate to have this position where I get to combine both academic research and curatorial practice in the museum. And the building I do this in is the one you see on the left. That's Medical Museion. It was built in 1787 as the Royal College of Surgeons of Denmark, when surgery was in the process of trying to argue that it was a proper profession and not something that was just done in barbers' shops, that amputations and tooth pulling. So they built this beautiful grand building to make an argument about the status of surgery as a real science. So that's the home of our museum. And on the right, you can see the Maersk Tower at the University of Copenhagen, where Renew, the stem cell center where George works, is based, and also where we have a lot of collaborations with stem cell scientists, also with metabolic scientists, with health complexity researchers and various other kinds of science. So these two buildings are extremely different. One is historical, lots of old bricks, and one is this architecturally awarded, very recent tall glass tower. But at the same time, I see both of these as places where knowledge is made about the body, about illness, and where ideas about the futures that we could have in relation to human well-being and health are generated. And what we really try to do in our research and at the museum is bring ideas back and forth between these two. So between these buildings, literally taking scientific objects from the labs and putting them in the museum on the main street, also taking museum objects from the museum and taking them to meet researchers and teaching them about the history of their disciplines, but also sending people back and forth to give talks and share events. as well as ideas back and forth, where we hope that art and science can both influence each other. So that's meant to be me biking back and forth across the city, taking ideas and objects back and forth. And in my research, I'm very interested not just in the kind of elite media of museum exhibitions, but also just in generally how social media, popular culture, the news kind of shapes the way that these ideas from biomedicine move into our everyday lives and then move back into science eventually, and how intervening in media can help us to intervene in those processes. So just to give you a couple of images of what it looks like in our museum, up in the top left, you can see the surgical dissection theatre from 1787. So you can see some busts of famous Greek philosophers. Hippocrates we've got up on the wall, and then also Danish surgeons of the 18th century who were trying to position themselves in this illustrious company in the auditorium. So in the old days, we had dissections of bodies, trying to get knowledge about bodies. Today, we have PhD defences, public events, art performances, trying to invite people who in the old days would never have been allowed into this building to come into our building and meet people from science, from medicine, from the worlds of arts, and talk about shared issues that we all are interested in our society. In the bottom left, you can see a dissection of a pig intestines being done at Culture Night. And then, of course, we host exhibitions. On the top right, there's an image from Mind the Gut, which I'll say a few more words about in a minute. Bottom middle, we have a bio artwork by the Austrian artist Thomas Feuerstein. And on the bottom right, it's my colleague Anna Bent Jensen giving a tour to a group of school kids and families who come through our museum. So even though we are really a museum for adults, we also have a really active schools program where tours given by our guides are a really important part of how we try to share the knowledge that we generate through our exhibition making with a wider audience. As well as exhibitions which people just come to and see, it's really important to us to use the opportunity we have of this public space, this public building, to stage and facilitate dialogue between people from different sectors, disciplines, and experiences. So sometimes you might choose to come to the auditorium and hear a famous scientist giving a talk about all the fantastic things they've learned over the years. So that's very much a kind of sitting and listening kind of experience. But you might also come to a workshop or a debate or an art performance where it's more about raising questions and sharing your own expertise, maybe as someone who's gone through an illness or as someone who might be a nurse in the healthcare system, and bringing that onto a more level playing field with scientific knowledge so that we can all learn from each other. And the final thing I want to say about the kind of work that we do at the Medical Museion is that we are a research group. So we're a public museum, but we're also a section of a department of public health in the University of Copenhagen. So we do humanities and social science research about medicine, and we also do science communication research about the models, theories, and data that you can get when people engage with science. And then we try and make those two things inform each other. So we do research to make our exhibitions better, and then we use our exhibitions to do research on what members of the public think about science to become science communication research. And we try to do this always in collaboration with scientists who are really at the cutting edge of scientific knowledge. So Renew, the Stem Cell Centre, and the Centre for Basic Metabolic Research are our biggest collaborators, but we also love to work with lots of different people from different disciplines. And one example of how this plays out is the exhibition I just showed you a photo of called Mind the Gut, where myself and my colleague Adam Benkard had really strong philosophical and social science interests in how I had this interest in how neuroimaging was entering popular media. And my colleague Adam was really interested in how people were getting interested in the microbiome. So, and I'll come back to that at the end of my talk today. And we thought that what was going on in popular media would be really interesting to tackle in an exhibition, which could be a bit more rich and deep. So digging into the medical history and the history of science, of how these ideas about the relationship between the brain and the guts, or digestion and feeling, have developed through the history of Western medicine, and also how we're tackling them in the laboratories of today. So we won an award to make this exhibition, where we tried to essentially kind of enrich the media landscape by engaging people with the methods and tools that we have at our disposal, which is exhibitions made of objects and artworks, and the chance to have people have slower slightly more chaotic discussions about the ideas going on than you might get in a news report or a very kind of quick fire social media conversation. And then that itself produces more research. So we've written chapters in books about the curation methods of the exhibition, and we're currently about to submit a paper where we've interviewed visitors about what they think about art and science being represented in the exhibition. So that's just to give an example of how research and exhibition practice inform each other in our work. And what we're always trying to do here is to bring together the worlds of the cutting edge of the present and how it imagines the future with the world of the past and how the past can really help us understand the present. So science today is in the media while it's still in the making. So 30 years ago, people would say, oh, let's not bother doing science communication about what's going on in the labs because it's too messy, it's too unsettled, it's too unfinished. And we'll just tell people something which could change in a year and they won't understand. But we can't do that anymore because of the way our media world has changed. People discover about science as it's happening, before it's settled and before it's fully certain. And therefore, institutions like public engagement, museums and other media, I think really have to join in, even if it might seem really difficult. And in that space, it's really important not just to share facts and what science finds out, but to engage people with understanding how science works and what it means, so they can be more critical consumers of other kinds of science communication they encounter. And one thing that we're really passionate about in the museum is to not underestimate public audiences and not to patronize them. So what we find is that audiences are often very curious about complexity as well as very invested in uncertain futures. They often don't come to the museum to find out just the boring settled facts, and they're quite willing to accept that things are really complicated and we don't really understand exactly how a certain investigation will pan out in the future. And you can tell good stories about complicated things, and that's something that we try and research at the museum. Okay, so that was my introduction to myself and what we do at the museum. And now I'm going to go into the second part of my talk, which is this brief history of approaches to science communication, which is sort of another way of telling the same story, but through the history of the discipline, which is how did we come to a place today where myself and the colleagues I work with and the funders who pay for what we do think that our approach to science communication is worth doing. Okay, so science communication is as old as science itself. People have always wanted to know, they've always been curious about what scientists are up to. And actually at the very beginning of science, scientists were often really just everyday people who had enough money and intelligence and curiosity to start doing science themselves. So there's always been this interest in science from the public. But there's also always been this idea from the kind of power elites, from governments, and from religion and all other kinds of powerful institutions in society, that science can be used to help people be better and behave better. So you can see on the left this poster for advertising from the Trowbridge Mechanics Institution in the UK, a talk from Mr. Droffnor on physiology and moral philosophy. So he's going to give a science talk to the kind of to the audience who comes along, to the working men, as identified at the bottom of the poster, where he really is trying to encourage people to improve their minds and improve themselves by learning about physiology. At the same time, you've always had science communication as a kind of protest, as kind of very negative, as people having hysterical, you might say, reactions to advances in science. So some of you might have seen this rather famous historical etching on the bottom right. But for those who haven't, this is by James Gilray from 1802, and it's called The Cowpox, or the Wonderful Effects of the New Inoculation, by the Publications of Ye Anti-Vaccine Society, 1802. So this is from the time of the first vaccine, which was using serum from cowpox rubbed into wounds on humans, which actually made them immune to smallpox, which was a far more dangerous disease. Now, this vaccine was discovered by the observation that milkmaids who worked with cows didn't get smallpox, so they must be immune for some reason that we didn't fully understand. So the vaccine was made by rubbing the cowpox into humans, which was very effective medically, but very, very stressful and anxiety producing for many people because it transgresses all kind of boundaries which vaccine researchers and public health systems still tackle today This idea that something taken from another species can be put in our bodies, it's very unnatural, it's risky, we don't know what will happen, is very much with us today, just as it was in 1802, when people became concerned that parts of cows might pop out of their skin if they got the vaccination. One cautionary note from history that I want to share with you from this image is that when I read up on the kind of history of these etchings, what I found out was that at the time in 1802, people were generally very accepting of the vaccine. It was a very small percentage of people who had this hysterical reaction. And it was actually only 50 years later, when the vaccines were made mandatory, so obligatory, that people started to get a little bit more anxious and protest against the vaccine. So that's a lesson I think that we can still take into the present today, that not to assume that all of the negative reactions we see to science represent the majority of the population, and also to remember that sometimes they can be satire or used for humor or community effects, and they don't necessarily mean that people will really are believing that cows are going to start popping out of their faces, for example. Also, there's a long history in science communication of supplementing schools. So of course, people learn science in schools, but science communication has always also had this idea of augmenting or supplementing school science education, often through demonstration. So actually through materiality, through things being hands-on, through being excited. So again, like the emotions and curiosity start being evoked here. So everything from Michael Faraday's Christmas lecture in 1856 to the very, very popular blowing bubble exhibit at our science centre here in Copenhagen. I know the curators of that exhibit, and it's a real pain for the experimentarium to run this. There's bubble liquid everywhere all the time, but it is so popular and so popular as a way of learning about science that they have to keep running it. So these histories of thinking about people as needing science in order to be healthier and better citizens, and people needing science communication to learn, to supplement their education, all very much fed into this thing we call the deficit model in science communication research. And this has an idea about publics as being deficient in knowledge, and science as being the best source of knowledge, and also about science as being fixed and progressing. So scientific knowledge is seen as being very certain and reliable, and it's just going to build up over time. So therefore, the public is ignorant and science can fill the gap. This model also has a particular idea about communication embedded in it, that communication is this kind of channel where you send packets of information down the channel to the audience, and that channel may be more or less clear and accurate. So the big question for communication is how we can translate most accurately the knowledge from science to the ignorant public. So that's the kind of dominant model up until about the 1980s or 90s. And this model really has the goal of just getting people to understand science. That's the primary goal. It's very pedagogical and didactic, but underlying that is this assumption that if people know more science, they'll listen to it, they'll believe it, they'll do what it says, and they'll love it. And actually what then starts to happen over the late 80s and through the 90s is that a lot of public crises and research in sociology starts to show us that actually that's not the case. Just educating people and pumping more information at them doesn't make them necessarily trust, believe, or love science. So in the UK, we had the very prominent crisis around BSE, or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, where politics and science got mixed up in a really unfortunate way. You can see here Minister John Gummer from the government fed his daughter a hamburger on TV to try and persuade the British public that hamburgers were safe to eat, even though he actually knew that scientists weren't sure they were safe. So this was a real crisis of public trust in the relationship between politics and science in the UK. Of course, another really good indicator of the fact that the classic deficit model wasn't actually making everyone love and do what science said was the protests that developed throughout the 80s and 90s around all different kinds of both scientific techniques, such as the stem cell protest on the bottom left, which is really about what science should be allowed to do, and also the AIDS protesters in the central image protesting against the way that medical research was excluding and not putting enough resources into studying gay men during the AIDS crisis. So lots of protests around science, around, again, the relationship between politics and science as well. And there was this very famous book, which any of you, or actually it's an article, any of you who are interested might want to look it up, from 1989, which is often brought up at discussions about the history of science communications turn away from the deficit model, and it's called Sheep Farming After Chernobyl. And this is a sociological case study where they report the ways in which the British government, again, didn't pay attention to the sheep farmers' local knowledge about how sheep grazing patterns might intersect with radioactive fallout from the Chernobyl disaster. And they refused to listen to that local knowledge or local science, and instead applied models which actually led to a lot of sheep being unnecessarily slaughtered and it taking a lot longer for the industry to recover. So these crises prompted a move towards more reciprocal dialogue. So this idea that we need to actually engage communities, learn and listen from their local knowledges, and not just tell people what to do, but find out why they're not doing what we think they should do. And this leads us to the second approach or model, which is the public engagement with science model. So here we've got an idea of publics as not just deficient in knowledge, but as actually knowing really important things, or maybe as like having some strong feelings and in need of better persuasion. So just by teaching them, we haven't persuaded them. Here, we also see a shift in ideas about what science is and how it works. So instead of seeing science as like fixed and certain and just always progressing, we see some acknowledgement that science is always in process and in context. It's fallible, things get corrected. We have results that are retracted, and science can't stand alone. In order for it to affect people's lives, it has to interface with politics and with other social systems. And once you acknowledge that, you really have to engage in dialogue. You can't just have this kind of one-way communication. So here we have ideas about communication rather than as just a kind of one-way street, it's a two-way street. But still, often there's this idea is that there's just packets of information or words being sent back and forth. So dialogue is very much a kind of talking thing, right, in most people's minds. We say something to each other, and then we say something back again. And here we move, even if we are still stuck a little bit with this information metaphor, the goal is really becoming like emotional as well as cognitive. So we need to change hearts as well as minds. We also can learn in both directions. And there's this recognition after all the crises of the late 20th century that trust and reputation of science are super important, and communication can really help to improve those. So we had this shift from deficit to engagement. But it wasn't a complete shift, and there were lots of critiques of the moves towards dialogue as well. And I suspect this will be a never-ending cycle of critiques and adjustments of each successive model. So to share a couple of the critiques that came up of public engagement, the first was that activities that said they were doing public engagement, where you had a dialogue, where both sides were listening as well as talking, actually weren't really dialogue. So people were invited to participate in dialogue with science, but actually science still held all the cards. They were still in power, they were still seen as the only experts. So people actually weren't really listened to at all. And this report, which had a really big impact in 2004, was from a think tank which argued that part of the problem was that public engagement was being done way too late. So what you call downstream from the laboratory, essentially. So if we wait too long to engage the public, basically all the decisions have been made, the science has been done, the collaborations with industry have been settled, the political position is taken, and therefore no matter what anyone thinks from the public, it's too late to change anything. So their argument was that we need to engage people upstream to find out what they think, feel, and want from science, while it's not too late to actually have that influence the direction that science or innovation in technology takes. And this isn't just a thing which you might think you need to do because it's democratic. There was also an increasing recognition that by not engaging people upstream, we're losing out on their knowledge. And this is particularly the case in biomedical innovation, where patients have a lot of lived experience, which can actually make science and innovation more efficient and come to market actually even quicker. And of course, some of you might be coming from scientific disciplines where it's really, really hard to see how upstream public engagement should shape science, for example, particle physics. And that's totally fine. The things I'm saying are really coming from my background in a biomedical museum, but also I hope that many of them have raised questions that are generally relevant to all different areas of science. So we end up kind of, 2010-ish with this idea that actually communication isn't just about sending information or words or dialogue from one person to another, but it's about people making meaning within and between each other in cultural contexts. So maybe a kind of overly simple way of thinking about this is, if a whole bunch of people watch the same science communication, animation, or news report in 20 different countries and cultural contexts, they won't make the same meaning from that. They won't necessarily understand the same things about how that's relevant to their lives and existing knowledge, because meaning doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens against the background of our existing knowledge, our existing beliefs, values, and social structures. It's also important to recognize, when you are thinking a lot about organizing science communication, that a lot of it is bottom up or unorganized by formal institutions. So it's also important to recognize, I think, that, you know, places like my museum, where we actually organize things, sell tickets and invite people, there's also much, much more going on where people are engaging with science on their own terms in the kind of wild anyway. And we have a lot to learn from going to those places and learning from people like biohackers, community science, citizens groups, fermentation workshops, like all different ways in which people are taking science into their lives and communities in ways that they find relevant and interesting. So we're landing up here with engagement as culture and identity. So publics are social, unpredictable. Science is one amongst many forms of knowledge. It's also full of values and choices, and it can't always be in control. And we start to see communication as being meaning made between people in context. So it's multi-dimensional, not just about cognition and words. And I think this place we are now with science communication, it's also about recognizing that there is not just one goal for science communication or public engagement. Goals are multiple. And what's really important is that we're transparent and reflective and talk to communities about what the goals are. So one of the things that happened with the crises of public trust and then the crises of failed dialogue was that the organizers of public science communication were not transparent about what they were trying to do, or they essentially lied about what they were trying to do. They were saying, we really want to listen to you and know what you think, but actually they didn't. And the worst thing for trust is when you invite people into something with a particular goal or promise, and then you fail to fulfill it. So that's one of the key messages, I think, from this history. And this has been illustrated in many ways. So this is a beautiful slide deck you can find online, showing the transition from the deficit model to the dialogue model, and finally to this more community or collaboration model. On the right, a slightly more sciencey version of this model from Karen Bultitude, where she looks at transmitting, receiving, and collaborating. So again, listening, dialogue, or actually co-creating. And the lessons I think we've learned from here is that no approach is inherently bad. It's not always bad to just give a talk where one person who knows a lot tells another group of people who don't know a lot what they know. That can also be a fantastic thing to do. But we really need to be transparent about our goals, and therefore which media or formats we need to fulfill them, and be honest about the limitations of our activities. I also really think we should stop seeing it as a fight between cognition and emotion, between the more like pedagogical or discursive approaches and the more like material or effective ones that we do in museums. They often actually both co-occur and really support each other, the same as with teaching and learning or creating and receiving. And I think that's always at play anyway, whether we try to make it the case or not. But by really delving into that, how cognition and emotion can support each other, we can make richer and more exciting communication experiences, particularly through art, aesthetics, and sensory experiences, as I've written here. And then the final lesson, I think, is that people create identities and communities around scientific ideas. And by going to those communities to find out what they know, need, and find exciting, we can have much more impactful science communication. And before I conclude this section and go on to my final set of examples, I wanted to acknowledge, particularly in this very international context, that this story I've been telling you is one which has been written many different ways in the science communication literature, but is very, very blinkered. It's very much a kind of global North English language communication story. And this is two slides again from Siddharth Kankara's and Aga Manna's An Inclusive History of Science Communication. And this is two slides where they remind us that a wide variety of cultures have been engaging in systematic ways of knowing and understanding the world, science, for many millennia now, and they've been sharing their knowledge for just as long. And they give this example of the people's science movements in India beginning in the 1960s, where scientists, writers, and social reformers together created, shared, and critiqued science information. So doing what in the UK became fashionable in the end of the 1990s. So it's really important to remember that some of these stories we tell are quite partial and geographically limited. And again, as with going to communities and bottom-up science communication, if it's done in a respectful and inclusive way, there's so much we can learn from each other in terms of multiple histories and ways of doing communication. Okay, so it's 4:40, so I'm going to try and speak for 5 or 6 more minutes on the end, and then we'll have time for some discussion. So the last thing I wanted to do was give you a sense of the kinds of activities that I do at the moment, which are kind of framed or grounded in these theoretical ideas about science communication and what it's for. And the examples I want to share with you today are all about the human microbiome. So how the microbes that live in and on us in symbiosis impact our health. And you can see on this slide here that this is also not only a hot topic in biomedical research, but simultaneously a hot topic in popular culture, in science education, and also in commercial products. Because the microbiome is something that you can quite cheaply and easily at least claim to intervene in. So you can see microbiome tests, love your gut, Belgian chocolate milk, mood probiotics, gut-brain symbiotics, relabeling and rebranding all kinds of supplements and diets with the claim that this is improving your microbiome. Not just going into products that can make a lot of money, this science was also very much taken up by media, particularly more like kind of highbrow media, as raising philosophical questions about human identity and human agency. So you can see the article on the left called What Your Microbiome Wants for Dinner, kind of invoking this kind of fun idea that actually we're not fully in control of ourselves. So in the past, it was like, it's not my fault, my brain made me do it. And in this example, it's not me eating all those sausages, it's my microbiome that wants the sausages. So there's this kind of, again, play into these kind of ancient cultural ideas, but also this kind of irresistible use of metaphors and cultural ideas for something which is actually leaping way beyond what the science can actually tell us now, where particularly at the time this was published, microbiome research was primarily correlational, not causational. So this is really jumping beyond what we know, but it's such a fun topic to discuss in a public setting. And a few years later, you can see on the bottom this article from Nature Reviews Microbiology. It's an editorial, which is very much addressing this question. It's called Hype or Hope. And it's talking about how much attention microbiome research has attracted, but really arguing actually at scientists that they should be cautious in not overselling or even over believing themselves in the scientific potential of microbiome research. So this very fascinating kind of argument going on between science, within science, with the media about, is this just hype, or are we being legitimately excited about what this science might lead to? And I think it's quite fun to note that this is happening not just in the media and on blogs and on Instagram, it's also happening on Nature front covers. You can see a lot of emotion, metaphors of the security blanket, of symbiotic travelers, of mirroring being used to illustrate microbiome research on the front cover of Nature. And then I've just got this one little quote to say that coming back to where I started with the idea that brain-based knowledge about neurochemical transmitters such as dopamine might be being meshed together with more like cultural ideas about personality types. Here, someone writes in an American newspaper, so you think you're the self-reliant type, a rugged individualist, of course, which is a very potent idea in the US. Well, give it up. You'd be nothing without the trillions of microbial minions toiling in your large intestine. You can see again these kind of cultural, political ideas and arguments being brought into how we talk about science. And artists are also then fascinated by this science. It seems to have these really interesting implications for identity and community, for our reliance on each other, the way that how we live, our dogs, our children, our diets, our architectures is all influencing our microbiome. Seems to open new avenues for engaging artistically and philosophically and activistically with questions about healthcare and resources and how we take care of people. So you can see here some artworks by Sonia Baumel, who scaled up agar plates to be big enough for human bodies, and then made, on the right-hand side, you can see a self-portrait of herself, and on the left-hand side, a performance work about the way that microbiomes of people who live together start to overlap with each other. And then at Medical Museion, we did this performance experiment by François-Joseph Lepointe. And I'm not going to play the whole video because I want time for questions. But the link is, I'll put the link in the chat so you can watch it later if you want to. But basically what we did, I'll just mute this and show you, was the artist walked around the University of Copenhagen, shaking hands with people, and then we sampled his skin microbiome every 50 handshakes. And then his idea was to see if the microbiome, so the combined genetic composition of every microbe on his hand would increase exponentially forever, or if it would hit some kind of limit when he'd shaken enough hands. And what we found really interesting about this project was the way that the student assistants we had following around the artist doing his performance were able to talk to people about their feelings about microbes. So they really wanted to understand what was going on and asked us all kinds of questions about the microbiome. But there was also a lot of discussion about feelings of like ickiness, about feelings of fear and danger around microbes. And this is pre-COVID, of course, we couldn't have done this handshake experiment even just a couple of years later. But this is an example of how we tried to combine real like cognitive science communication about the microbiome with an investigation of how we feel about our microbial relationships to each other. And finally here I have a image of a art installation called Co-Metabolize, which again combines feelings and words. It is produced to mimic the microbiome composition present in sourdough bread, and then there's a huge sourdough in the middle, and the artists and participants in this art installation could work with the sourdough and then eat bread baked from it, which had been kneaded by the hands of many other visitors. So again, provoking ideas about our connections to and dependencies on each other. And I'm going to stop there because I really want to hear what you think. So I'll just stop sharing my slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louise. The floor is open. You can type your questions in the chat if you prefer that, or you can come through voice and picture. I have a list of questions, so I will just pick one, maybe to initiate to allow some time for people to get prepared. But just to go to the beginning of your talk, you talked about this looping effect, and I was wondering. So it reminds me something I had. It was like more like a meme thing that the brain is so. Let's see how it was phrased. Like it's so. If we could understand it, we would be too dumb to do it. Something like that. So, and I think it's kind of similar that we are influenced by ourselves when we try to study something that is, it is what we feel. Is ourselves. So I was wondering if this looping effect, you have seen it in other fields.
That's a really good question. I think it has a particular version when we're talking about the mind and brain, because as you say, that is kind of the question of human subjectivity. So when we learn about ourselves biologically, we might change how we act. So Ian Hacking really developed that concept around kind of neuroscience and psychiatry. But I think we can use it much more widely to remind ourselves that public reactions to and public usage and public play with scientific ideas can actually end up shaping science, because when publics get really interested or protest or whatever it is, it shapes things like funding priorities, it shapes scientists' interests. More kids go to study whatever science is most popular on social media when they're teenagers. So there's lots of ways in which popular culture, science, and society kind of loop around with each other. So I think it's a useful way of reminding ourselves that it's not like there's some like great rational science machine up in the sky which decides what science should be done and then it gets done and it's finished. But we're always looping back and forth between what science knows, and yeah, social and personal reactions to it.
Thank you. Any questions? Julia?
Hi, I think this is if I talk. Louise, I was thinking if you could talk a little bit, how do you see the space of really basic research in science communication, especially when you talk about this dialogue? And I think basic research sometimes is harder for the public to influence or grasp, or do you think it's still possible?
Yeah. So I think it's very much a case of looking at that, like, you know, when I showed that kind of spectrum where we can transmit, we can listen, or we can collaborate, and thinking, okay, here's the science I'm working with, and here's what I want to achieve with a public audience, and this is potentially then what's possible within that space. Because it might be that actually, with very fundamental research, it's not close enough to policy or to social issues to engage with this in that way. And then we can find other routes into it. But it depends what you want to achieve. So I think, my first question would be, you know, what research is it, and what do we want to happen to people? Because if we want them to just get curious and excited, there's all kinds of ways we can do that with, for example, many different sciences have imaging. Sometimes actually the history of science can be a really powerful way. We could find exciting case studies, even in, like, say, fundamental physics, of new discoveries. We could actually go to the history of bioinformatics to show particular key moments when it changed the healthcare system. So I think even if the research that's happening in the field right now today isn't graspable in terms of people's everyday lives, we can use history and connections to make it relevant to them, or we can just go for its, like, beauty and fascination and excitement. I think there's just such a whole spectrum of things we could be trying to do to and with people when we do science communication, that there's no one answer to that, I think.
Yeah, okay. Maybe if I can continue already on this line, because then you talk about beautiful and beauty and fascination.
Yeah.
From your experience in the museum, because we see so much people going for things that are Instagrammable or that they can post online.
Yeah.
So how is this balance you see in the museum? Do we really achieve, like, science? I mean, if it's science education is the goal, or science interaction, or would it be just art from the visitor's perspective? What's your take on it?
So is your question?
Sorry.
No. Let me see if I can say the question back and see if I got it right. So is your question, if we're actually trying to just make things beautiful and exciting, are we really engaging people with the science?
Yeah, not in the intentional part, but I mean in how we are really achieving it nowadays. If we're achieving.
So I think if your goal is just, for example, to get kids excited about science, there's nothing wrong with just tapping into beauty and fascination, and then they actually learn about science at school or at university. But if your goal is to actually really get people to understand say, for example, you want people to understand things like scientific hypothesis generation and falsification, and how knowledge becomes more certain, then just beautifying the images from the microscope is not going to do anything for anyone. And like with the fMRI images that really sparked my whole journey in this space, the fascination of those images completely obscured all of the scientific complexity and uncertainty that went into their production. So one of the things I tried to do in my engagement was then to respond to that by doing public engagement, which really tried to pull apart, how do you make a brain image, and how does it come to look like something that's a photograph, whereas actually it's not a photograph at all. It's a graph that's turned into something else. And I think in telling those kind of stories, you can really try to hook on to things which actually work really well on social media, like, aha, it's not what you thought it was, or don't be fooled by people telling you it's simpler than you think. So I think a lot of those things that we find maybe exciting and funny about those kind of images, both as media consumers in our kind of non-science lives, but also when we critique each other's scientific productions, we can use those moments of kind of emotion or surprise to do better communication about how science works. Yeah. Someone has a question in the text or a comment, maybe?
So Maren writes, of course, we always ask ourselves, who are we writing for? What is the audience? Where do people stand? What needs do they have? But people writing in science are often afraid to write texts that in their eyes might seem to be too simple, and they keep their role in the professional community in mind. But on the other hand, they need to talk about their findings to the public, especially for publicly funded projects. Do you have a good
Yes.
advice for them?
Yes, I don't know if it's good advice, but I have some thoughts and some things which I've heard from other scientists who've had these kinds of dilemmas. I think one thing you have to do is acknowledge that it's not always going to go well, and to really pick and choose where you talk in public. So, for example, if a journalist from a newspaper where you really think their coverage of science is horrible calls you up, don't do that interview. Whereas if a journalist from another newspaper who you think has a bit of a better approach to science calls you up, maybe do it, but also be aware that they won't put everything you said in the article. It will frustrate you in some ways. But then the flip side of that is, if you don't do it, who else is going to do it? So there's this kind of public service kind of what would you say, like weighing scale you're trying to do, like as I think Maren alludes to in the question, there's a kind of public service element to sharing the knowledge in public, but then there's also like the personal debate with yourself, like, is it worth it? How bad will it be if I'm misunderstood? How bad will it be for my career? And I think the vast majority of times it's not actually going to have a terrible outcome, and you can just go ahead, and then you can use some really practical tools. So if you're going to do anything that's going to be edited by someone else, whether it's a video or talking to a journalist or whatever, ask to see the final cut before it goes live. And if you can't do that, I always prepare talking points. So these are things I definitely want to get across, and these are things that no one is going to make me express an opinion on, no matter how hard they push. Because I think one of the things that goes wrong is journalists or discussants or even members of the public try and push a scientist to speak beyond their expertise into an area they're uncomfortable with. So I think thinking for yourself beforehand, actually, based on my science, I'm not prepared to comment on how this relates to, I don't know, the politics of wind farms or whether people should be allowed to wear religious clothing in public. Like, you just kind of place your own boundaries around what you're willing to say on the basis of your science, and that can protect you from those kind of accidental slips where you end up going further than you can. But ultimately, I love science communication, but if you think that those weighing scales for you, actually this risk is not worth it, then don't do it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Ashish is writing, "Hi Louise, great presentation. I was wondering about the medium for science communication, since you showed some artwork, some rally as well. Should one unique platform be enough to make the idea heard, or does each idea demands a separate platform? Also, how do you see the SciComm landscape changing in the future, especially with the advent of generative AI?
Oh, good one. I think some media are better suited for some kinds of science communication goals. So it's very much, I think of it as a kind of toolbox or a tool bag, and you're picking the tools that are best to like make the kind of thing you want to make. For example, short social media statements are not the easiest in which to unfold how scientific method works, for example. And some image-based sciences are extremely well suited to 2D photography, for example, whereas others are much better attacked by looking at the laboratory objects or getting an artist to make an installation. So I really just think it's the same as with designing any kind of scientific project, is thinking like, what tools and what approaches can I use to investigate this question or create this phenomena that I'm interested in. But art is definitely not enough. It's one of the things I'm particularly passionate about, but I really see science communication as an ecology. And anything we do is also, its impact is affected by everything else that's going on around us. And I think that should make us like humble, but also not too depressed if we don't achieve everything we want to, because we're really part of an ecology. So also finding out stuff going on in your field or your local area or institution with science communication can also, I think, really help to get inspiration for the media that can work for particular topics, but also to help us feel like we're part of something bigger. Generative AI, I don't know. What do you think?
Are you asking me or everyone?
Ashish.
Okay. I don't know, because it depends. Because science communication is such a vast topic, and
Yeah.
so it depends on what you're communicating. But I think I would use Gen AI for some ideas for sure.
Mm-hmm.
How can we communicate this to
Mm-hmm.
even audience, for
Mm-hmm.
instance?
Yeah.
It might give us some ideas which we might not have thought about, or in that particular moment at least.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely not an expert, but I've started to play with it a little bit. And I think I definitely, at the moment at least, use it as an ideation tool. I think that's also what you're saying. So for example, I was trying to think of like images that we could use that would communicate stem cells, but without being just a picture of a stem cell. So I was kind of putting various prompts in, and it comes up with some really interesting metaphors. And like, for example, eggs with trees growing out and stuff that I never would have thought of myself if I just started. And those images, they're terrible. I'm not going to use them, but it's given me an idea for another place to go and look for other things. And yeah, Julia writes about the cultural bias of AI. And I think that's the other point I wanted to raise as well, because I think just like the science communication landscape until about 10 years ago being extremely culturally biased, generative AI is so culturally biased. It's very, very hard to get anything other than a thin white person unless you specify in the prompt. And that's really problematic for science communication for sure.
Thank you.
May I ask, Louise, because I see that science becomes, as many things, politicized.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering sometimes, how can we break the barrier towards, the other side? And
oh, yes. Yeah. I think it makes. I think partly it's important to accept that some people will not change their minds based on science communication. And that's okay. And we need to find the people who maybe are on the fence, maybe are open to change, to make impact where we can and not try to achieve something that's just going to make us depressed and feel like a failure. And I also think, if I'm completely honest, some of these issues we cannot solve. Issues such as, it just came out the other day about fact checking on Meta. These kind of issues about how our media ecosystem works, we cannot completely get around those, no matter how fantastic community engagement we do. But we can do our best in the spaces where we can have most impact, and then hopefully have inspiration and impact further up the chain. And at least that's how I think about it, being based in the place where I am. Whereas if you're a policymaker or someone in a funding agency, I think you have other opportunities to really make demands about how people communicate in better ways. But there's one kind of very concrete project that I think is really beautiful example of this. So, and I could share it with anyone who's interested. I can't remember the name right now, but it was a scientist in the US, and she put a climate scientist, I think, so very like politically charged in the US. And she put like a sandwich board around her neck, which said, "I'm a scientist, ask me anything." And she went walking around in like very Republican cities. And she basically was inviting people to just come and have a chat with her about science. And it was so disarming that she actually, and there's this article where she talks about what happened. Some people are just like, "No, I'm not talking to you." But a lot of people actually found it an opportunity to get curious about where their received ideas about science came from. And it can spark something which then goes somewhere else. And I think that's the other thing about science communication. The change is never going to happen in one event. You're sparking something which might lead someone to ask another question somewhere else, or go to another event next week or next year, or talk to their grandma. So it's really hard to track those little trajectories over time. And that's one of the big challenges for SciComm research, actually, is how we can track those slower, less direct impacts of what happens. But I think we have to believe in them to keep going.
Makes sense. Thank you very much. Any last questions? Otherwise, we're 5 minutes past 5 here in Central Europe. And I would like to thank Louise for this fascinating talk, and also sharing your opinions in all these different complex topics.
Yeah, no easy answers to any of these. Thanks for the great questions, everyone, and for the invitation to join you today.
So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much,
That
Louise.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.